So I started the live webinar now. Wonderful, wonderful.
Like that too. It's a very current affair. Well, prior to 2020, she produced investigative and explanatory magazine stories for ZDF's primetime program Frontal 21. She's sitting in Germany at the moment. We also have online Karen Jensen, Pay Equity Commissioner of Canada. Karen is really experienced lawyer who has represented unions, employers, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission in pay equity disputes at very different points in her career. And prior to joining the commission, Karen was a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright LLP and was a national and local in Ottawa, chair of the Labour and Employment Group. Talking to you about equal pay. Fantastic. I go to the third person online. We have Manuela Tomei, Director, Conditions of Work and Equality Department of the ILO. Manuela is Director of this department at the ILO since 2013. She has held various posts at ILO headquarters in Geneva and also at the regional offices in Peru. And last year in February, we have met on the last event before Corona in Berlin during a very epic conference, meaning the Equal Pay International Coalition. Also online is Alex Chadwick, Manager and of Gender Pay and Pay Equity Task Force at Te Kawa Mataho. That's the Public Service Commission in New Zealand. And you look great. And I know what time it is. So very proud to have you here as well in New Zealand with us on board. Alex is a senior manager, lawyer, and diversity and inclusion practitioner with expertise in devising and implementing strategies to effect positive workplace culture change. Alex currently leads the New Zealand's government's task force established by the Public Service Commission and the Ministry for Women to close the gender pay gap in the public service and to support achievement of pay equity in the wider state sector. You have a cup of coffee. We send you even more digital coffees for this challenging time. And we'll go straight into the discussion. And I have a question here for Manuela to start off with. Fair pay is moving up on the international agenda. We've seen now also in Europe and everywhere where we see the development from year to year really, really increasing. Now we just heard from Helena Dalli, the European Commission has introduced its framework to advance pay transparency. How do you rate this development?
Well, first of all, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this important and timely panel. Well, to respond to your question, the European Commission's proposal on pay transparency is a very important and timely step in the journey towards achieving equal pay for work of equal value. It is important for at least 4 reasons. First, it complements other related measures that were adopted at the European level, both of binding and non-binding nature, showing that to address such a complex phenomenon, we need an arsenal of measures. Second, it facilitates the detection of potential discrimination in pay, and by making it easier for employees to learn how much they make relative to other employees in the same or similar job or in a job of equal value. Third, it prevents the reproduction of potential gender bias in pay determination by forbidding the employer to ask about a history from a job applicant, and also requesting employers to specify the entry wage wage range for any given job in job vacancies. And last but not least, it provides employers and workers with the tools to correct and detect pay discrimination, and offers also guidance on how workers can claim their rights. The proposal, as I said, is important and timely, and it's timely because, as the commissioner herself highlighted, The gender pay gap stands at 20% in the world on average, 14% in Europe before the outbreak of COVID-19. But these gaps are likely to worsen following the pandemic, with the risk of slowing down economic recovery. Indeed, according to a recently released ILO Global Wage Report, the total wage bill loss for women in the first 2 months of the pandemic in 2020 in the EU was 8.1% compared to 5.4% for men. And this was the result of women's overrepresentation in low-paid jobs and the fact that the cut in hours worked was higher for women than men. We were talking about the importance of indeed looking at what may indeed make this wage transparency law work. I think that the actual value of such laws will depend very much on how effectively they are implemented. And success will depend also to a large extent on the buy-in by employers and workers and their representative organizations. I think it's important that wage transparency laws provide some negotiation space for social partner organization to determine how best improvements can be made. And just a last point, we at the ILO are currently mapping the various pay transparency laws in the EU and beyond, and assessing their impact to understand what works and what works less well. And as part of the publication, we are conducting surveys of workers and employers organizations in countries with a pay transparency law in place in order to get their insights and see how best we can promote the effective implementation of pay transparency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Manuela. We'll come back a bit later again to the thoughts on what's happened over the past year. I want to switch to Birte. You've heard now what the Commission released. You've seen that. You've heard what Helena Dalli said. You've heard Manuela. In the statement, the European Commission accused the member states of non-compliance with the European value of fair pay. Now, Birte, what do you think? How long is this directive actually overdue? But how do you evaluate the political discussion to come to actually make it happen, so to say? Please turn on your microphone.
Classic, sorry. Obviously it's long overdue because not much has happened over the last decades in Europe. That is especially true for Germany, because Germany is notoriously slow in putting European anti-discrimination directives into German law. It hasn't done so since 1976, and that's for the last anti-discrimination directive. So even though I'm very, very excited about this directive to come on pay transparency, I am slightly skeptical in sort of when this direction is going to reach and have an effect in Germany. So I think this will take a little while to actually to be effective in Germany, even though I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was a couple of years ago, because I think public debate has become a little less fierce and less hostile against women, as employers are slowly realizing, even in sort of conservative Germany, that paying women less for work of equal value clearly is a bit of an atavism in aging societies of Western Europe that depend highly on educated women. That would be brief.
No worry about timing. If you have to be brief, I'll just tell you about it. Give us what you need to say, because I was, while you were talking, also thinking about what Manuela had just said about evaluation of pay transparency measures. And you're saying you think Germany might not be so fast, but maybe are others faster. So before I carry on, just one short question back to Manuela also. Do you have any first insights that you could share on that evaluation? Something short you want to add?
Well, not really, in the sense that there are, of course, I mean, this is a relatively recent development in a number of countries. And I have to say that on a positive note, countries that have introduced these types of law are also conducting some assessment of the impact of the law. So there is a concern indeed about monitoring the effects of the law. And when we are talking of the effects of the law, I think it's important also to be clear in terms of which impacts are we monitoring or looking into. Of course, the decline of the gender pay gap at company level, it's a sort of desirable ultimate goal. But I think what is also very important is to look into the take-up rate, or how many of concerned or interested women or men have indeed requested for information to be provided on the pay of other co-workers and other employees, because asking about it is also an indication of the fact that the person trusts the system, that there is no fear that retaliation will follow after such a request. So I think, results are still very preliminary. We are still in the process of gathering data, but on a good side, governments that have those laws are indeed looking into monitoring their impact in order to also reorient or refine implementation of it. Back to you.
Thank you. I would go to Alex now, Alex Chadwick, for a question. In 2013, so that's already like 8 years ago, a female employee working in a care home sued for higher pay because she attributed the lower wage paid to caring for the elderly to the fact that it was predominantly women doing that work. The court then ruled in favor of the claimant, and as it was possible to demonstrate the systematic discrimination. How has this case actually changed the discussion around fair pay in New Zealand? What can we sort of learn from it and take of it? Alex, please.
Well, kia ora koutou katoa, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody from New Zealand, where it's 4:29 a.m. So I apologise for my puffy face. Yes, New Zealand. Just a bit of sort of an intro and context for New Zealand. Our goal at a government and a public service level is to achieve fairer pay for the lowest paid workers, and particularly for women. And we've had some concerted work in this area since 2017, driven by government, but also public service goals. And we're making some really good progress on that. In the work in the public service, we've, with some targeted effort, dropped the gender pay gap by 2.6% in the last 2 years, which is actually the biggest drop in 17 years since we started measuring. And we've currently got 19 pay equity claims across the state sector under the new legislation. But to answer your question about the Christine Bartlett case, it really has been a pivotal point for New Zealand in changing the way that we think about equal pay and overhauling the way that we as a country address historical undervaluation in female-dominated occupations. So just to talk a little bit about that case, Christine Bartlett was a care worker in an aged care home, and together with her union, she filed a claim against Terra Nova, which is a rest home company in the Employment Relations Authority in 2012. The case was appealed by Terra Nova, and it culminated in a Court of Appeal decision, which essentially looked at whether our Equal Pay Act, which was 1972 at the time, could allow claims around pay for work of equal value and not just simply the same pay for the same work. And the Court of Appeal held that it could. So that was groundbreaking for us here in New Zealand, having that definition of equal pay expanded at law and broadening the range of claims that could be brought under that legislation. But the government's reaction to that claim was then, rather than Christine Bartlett having to pursue the claim again through the court system, was the government announced a historic $2 billion pay equity settlement for care and support workers throughout New Zealand. And it was a unique settlement in that it was dedicated, given effect by a dedicated statute, the Care and Support Workers Act of 2017. So So that covered 55,000 workers in aged and disability residential care and home community support services across the country. And they received over a period of 5 years pay rises between 15 and 50%, depending on their qualifications and experience. So to put that in practical terms, the minimum wage for many at the time was $15.75 an hour, and the majority were moving to about $19 an hour, sort of a 21% pay rise. So it really was a pivotal point for us, and it sort of has paved the way for what has become culminated in an amendment to our Equal Pay Act and a whole new process for addressing pay equity in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. You have this new law also since 2020. So what we call what you call the Equal Pay Amendment Bill, and this is intended to curb gender-specific wage discrimination in sectors where women again predominate. As that's not so long ago, has this already changed things since it was implemented? And also because you were talking about this massive drop of the pay gap, which is just really, really impressive. Has your Prime Minister taken political leadership for this drop actually also? This would be interesting to see.
So to clarify, the drop is in the public service at the moment, and that's particularly because we've had a concerted action plan for all public service agencies to adhere to, which is covering areas of equal pay, flexible work by default, gender balanced leadership, and targeting bias and discrimination in remuneration systems and practices. Our overall national gender pay gap relative to that has remained fairly constant. But what the legislation has done is it basically allows, has set up a process whereby an individual or a union can raise a claim that their work is undervalued based on sex, and then it sets aside a process for the parties to work together to address and investigate that undervaluation using our existing collective bargaining framework, so without resort to the court. It's a very cooperative process, and it basically allows the parties to work together to assess the work of the claimant and then the work of male-dominated comparators that the parties select. And if they consider that there is undervaluation, they then bargain for a corrected rate. So we currently have 19 claims in the state sector. We haven't seen any claims in the private sector yet, which is quite interesting. They're a bit slow off the mark there, but the legislation has actually only been in force since November of last year. Many of these claims had actually been raised prior, because before the legislation came into force, the government had a series of pay equity principles, which they mandated were to be used for the resolution of pay equity claims outside of the court process. And those principles have actually been enshrined in the legislation now that it's in force. So it's the same process, but it has been adopted in a number of claims prior to the legislation coming into force. And we've had 4 settlements so far. They're covering probably about, I would say, 80,000 employees. And on average, those settlements have seen pay increases of about 30%. So it's really, and we've got a lot more to come. And some of these claims are very big, sector-wide claims in the areas of education, health, social services, and they're multi-union, multi-employer claims. So they're pretty complex things, and it's going to be, very huge for New Zealand. We're a small country, we have a small population. So this is quite groundbreaking, for us.
Absolutely. And it's like, just because you're a small country doesn't mean that you can't do big steps. And often I can see when I've seen similar phrases also from Iceland who say they're very small, and it's always like these small ones, and you can move faster sometimes. I have the feeling that some things, not everything, some things are easier in small countries or can be moved faster. And on the other side, it's for the big ones, like saying, they are only small, it's not the same. That's not true, because paying fairly is the same no matter how big or small a country or a company is. So I think it's very important not to nag on somebody being, or some country being small or big, but having so many good things to sort of look what have happened in your country, others might as well just copy and paste it, and maybe they adapt a little bit. So I think Small and bold, that's the right path. Yeah, I'll come back. We'll carry on later, but I'll go and move now to Karen as well. At least a very, from the size of the country, a huge country. I think the population is not as huge compared to the ground, but Canada is a lot more square meters than New Zealand. And Karen Jensen, you are the first appointed pay equity commissioner in Canada at a federal level. And various states are very active already for years on this matter. But what has changed through your position? And what are, from your vision, sort of the major plan that you have for your first term in this office, in this position, Karen?
Yes, thanks, Enrique. And let me first thank the CSW for inviting Canada to participate in this event. It's really exciting to share what's going on among different countries to address the issue of gender equality. I was appointed as the first federal pay equity commissioner in October of 2019 in the federal jurisdiction, which is as you know, Canada is a federation. Some of the provinces in Canada have enacted pay equity legislation, but not to the same extent, I would say, as the legislation that was enacted in 2018 in Canada. In the federal jurisdiction. That legislation is not yet in force. We anticipate that it will be in force in the fall. But what that legislation does essentially is something that you alluded to, Henrika, in your opening comments. It takes the burden off of individual employees or unions to raise a complaint or bring a claim regarding pay equity. It's called proactive pay equity legislation, and it requires employers to proactively look at their workforce, determine which job classes are male or female predominant, and then to evaluate those jobs on the basis of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And when the jobs are comparable in value, the employer is required to compare the compensation and ensure that work of comparable value, even though it may be very, very different, is paid the same. And employers in the federal public and private sector will have 3 years once the legislation comes into force. So that would be, let's say it comes into force in the fall of this year. By the fall of 2024, all employers in the federal jurisdiction will be required to have completed their pay equity analysis and to have posted the results of that analysis. Now, the legislation is extremely demanding and prescriptive. It also provides for a considerable amount of support by my office in terms of developing tools and educational materials to enable, to build capacity among employers and unions, because there is a cooperative aspect to this legislation, so that employers who have 100 or more employees or any degree of unionization must do the pay equity plan as a committee with their employees. So we are working very, very hard in this first year to develop those tools, to develop the capacity among employers and unions, and to work hard to inform employees of their rights under this legislation. It's incredibly detailed legislation with a set of regulations that have just come out that are really very challenging. So, you know, we have really committed, especially during this economic challenge, this period of extreme economic challenge, to working with employers, many of whom are struggling financially, to implement this challenging legislation. And that's involved quite a bit of outreach and stakeholder consultation. So we're taking very much a modern regulatory approach. where we begin with capacity building, and then we move through the spectrum as time goes on to a more compliance and enforcement-based model once employers are aware of their obligations and have the capacity to meet those. Interestingly, as Manuela explained, the COVID pandemic has really, in some ways, assisted us in the work we're doing, and in other ways made it harder. It has, in fact, delayed the legislation coming into force because the Canadian government, like most governments, has been working hard to support Canadians through this difficult time. But it's also put in bold relief the way in which we undervalue, all countries undervalue the essential work done by women in caregiving, clerical roles throughout the economy. And it's made many employers recognize that there is a real systemic discrimination problem in the way that we value and compensate work that is done largely by women. And so there is a willingness that I'm perceiving in my conversations with employers to address that, whereas there might have been some more stiff resistance to that in the past. There's now, in some ways, a resignation, and in other ways, an eagerness to actually address this issue of pay discrimination and pay inequity and move ahead with it. So, you know, we're really excited. We've been building a brand new dispute resolution platform that will provide employers and unions with an opportunity to have their disputes as they work together in committees resolved efficiently and fairly so that they can meet the 3-year time frame, and so that they can, you know, they don't have to wait for a long time for mediation and decisions to be rendered on any disputes that might come up during the course of their process of working out the pay equity plan. So it's been a very exciting year, and I look forward to more excitement as we move on with the project.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to also know from you, in the media, we hear sometimes that first salary increases have been made already even before the legislation has been passed. Do you think this can create a snowball effect? And also a question from the audience that was passed to me, are there any exceptions for SMEs?
Okay, so that is very interesting. I'll deal with the first question first, and then remind me if I forget to address the SME part. But in fact, there is no legal requirement at this point that employers begin to do the work of analyzing their pay system. And in some ways, what we have been saying is, you know, be careful before you embark on that process, because if you are one of those employers that's required to do that in committee with your employees and your unions, you need to wait until those committees are established to begin that work, because it is very much a collaborative enterprise that they're engaged in some ways, like the New Zealand model, although it's less of a negotiated thing and more of a rights-based approach. But there are employers that are so eager to begin, and some where they don't have to be in committee, that they have begun to look at the work, and they've begun to look at their pay structure to determine whether or not there are gaps there that they need to be addressing. But what has been in the press more so has been a debate about whether or not employers can delay making adjustments until 2029. And the federal pay equity legislation that I implement does require that the first adjustments to salaries be made within 3 years of the coming into force of the Act, which would be 2024. However, if the total amount to be paid in adjustments is more than 1% of the payroll, the employer can spread out the payments over a 3 or 5 year period, depending upon their size. But they must make that first payment within 3 years. So then in terms of the SMEs, the small employers who are under 100 employees, they can build their pay equity plan without the involvement of a union, but they must do so within the same 3-year period. They also can phase in their pay equity adjustments if the amount owing is over 1%, but they still have to make their first adjustments within a year. All employers can petition my office for an increased phase-in period if they're experiencing extreme financial hardship. But again, they have to demonstrate that extreme financial hardship. We are developing a tool for small and medium-sized employers that we're very excited about. That's quite a bit like the Fair Pay Innovation Labs tool, because we recognize that small and medium-sized employers really need support. So the tool is an Excel based tool now, but will move into the cloud, whereby employers can input their data and get a kind of an end-to-end solution that will show them if they have a pay gap and tell them how much they need to pay on a regular basis in order to close that gap. So we're very excited about the development of that tool.
Yeah, me too. That's another discussion to follow, the topic of the analysis. We will keep you all, of course, posted on what's developing at that stage. Karen, I will switch now to Germany and come back to you in a little while. I'll go to Germany to Birte Meyer now, because all this legislation, we have this Wage Transparency Act in Germany, the Entgelttransparenzgesetz. I just love this word. And it's entered into force 3 years ago. So far, this law has been labeled as a toothless tiger. This winter, we had 2 major court decisions that added strength to this law. One was the German Federal Arbitration Court has ruled that European anti-discrimination law needs to be applied in Germany too. So now, if a woman receives the information that the man's median wage is higher, then the burden of proof is immediately reversed. Now, from your position, Birte, how do you actually evaluate this decision?
There are actually 2 decisions by the German Federal Arbitration Court regarding the Entgelttransparenzgesetz. And I think they're both true landmark decisions which will alleviate the burden of suing for equal pay for German women significantly. I mean, there are reasons why in Germany, compared to the US or to the UK, hardly any woman ever sued for equal pay, and if so, they tended to lose. The reason for that is that German labor courts until recently have asked women to prove that not only do they perform work of similar value and are paid less than comparable men, but also women needed to show that the reason why they're paid less was rooted in their gender or sex. That, of course, is completely impossible. So women lost in court. So employers had very little incentive to actually correct discriminatory pay structures. So with those rulings by the German Federal Arbitration Court, now women don't have to prove that they're actually being paid because they're women, but employers, of course, need to prove that they're paying women less, not because they're women, but for justified reasons. That is the early reversal of the burden of proof, which, of course, has been established case law by the Court of Justice of the European Union for very many years now. In effect, what I think we see from those 2 decisions, and again, I don't know how long this is going to last, is that employers in Germany are going to double check if their wage structures might be in fact non-discriminatory, because for the first time in German history, individual women have now a chance to take their equal pay claims to court and actually have a chance of winning. And as we all know from cases abroad, these claims can become very expensive and very troublesome for employers. So I think these two court cases and these 2 decisions have made me very, very happy. And I think they're based on real results.
Yeah, that's good. And there is always this talk in Germany also that only 4% of employees use their right to information. And it's always mentioned actually that this instrument is like failing its intentions, especially this law. Knowing now about these new decisions, would you still agree to this statement? Or do you think maybe now more people will ask, or we get some different movement into the whole discussion on the German law?
Oh, I think it would definitely get more movement. I think the formerly toothless tiger has become little baby teeth. Of course, there's more to efficient lawmaking than pay transparency and early burden of proof. We need there's still, I mean, the evaluation of the toothless tiger was 18 pages long, and not a single flaw has been touched by German government. There's still very many issues to be resolved. One of them is what happens to women who sue. Is there retaliation? Are there litigation limits? How far, sort of, for how many years backwards are women being compensated? There's a lot of tricky details to be solved for it to become the tiger with tiger teeth. However, given that this law has been such a disastrous thing that has been debated about for so many years and then had so very little effect, I think that this might in effect change, because what we all know now is that every court case that goes through the instances regarding the Wage Transparency Act and will end at the Federal Arbitration Court will come to the 8th Senate, which has done those two revolutionary rulings. So, so every court case that goes through the instances will in effect probably make this law a lot better. Of course, there's more efficient ways of making laws efficient than having women through the instances. However, at least there's some slight hope at the end of the lawmaking transparency debate. I hope.
Yeah, definitely. Being German myself, I always look at this law and I see all the others, and I think that it just has the wrong direction. It directs the people. Every other country directs the companies, and I mean, where does the money come from that's sort of being paid out unfairly? It comes from the company. So the direction of the law is, for me, the worst thing about it, actually. So I was like thinking in that direction, maybe this gives it a little twist, hopefully. But yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we will keep on walking and see that the companies just pay fairly because they like it. I want to jump to New Zealand again at this point, because New Zealand major court cases have guided actually the discussion. We've heard a bit already. And your new bill, Alex, also contains a mechanism to settle disputes easier. And we've just heard with Bert, a dispute is a tricky thing. How do you value such settlement mechanisms for the effectiveness actually of a legal framework on fair pay? What can we learn from New Zealand?
Well, a lot of our employment relations framework is based on trying to resolve things between the parties at the lowest level without escalating to court. And so that's through our Employment Relations Act too. The pay equity legislation, so our new amended Equal Pay Act, is similar. So once a pay equity claim is raised, the parties are intended to work together through the process. If they cannot agree at any point in time in that process, then there is a dispute resolution process under the Act to follow, and it includes usually mediation as a first step, facilitated bargaining, and then there is a role for the authority or courts if the parties still are unable to reach a resolution. If you apply straight to the authority for a determination, they will first consider whether the parties have actually used the mediation options or facilitation first before they will hear the case. So there is quite a lot of onus on the parties to try and work together to problem solve and to be creative about finding a way through, and that the court should very much be a last resort. And as part of the pay equity process, the parties enter into what's called a bargaining process agreement or terms of reference, which outlines the process that they're going to take for managing any disputes or issues that might arise in the context of the claim as they work through, and how they intend to approach that. So we haven't actually had any claims that have yet had disputes that have escalated to the authority. There's been one application I'm just aware of this week, and it was in relation to a disagreement over the use of a particular comparator for midwives pay equity claim. So that's just been lodged with the authority. So we'll watch the space, but the parties will be directed back to mediation first. So it may be some time before we get any sort of case law. So that's the other thing, though. There are advantages to sometimes having determinations on these things. We have some questions about interpretation in the legislation, and it could be some time before we actually get some case law on that to help guide us with how to interpret some of the provisions.
Thank you. Looking at laws and what we can sort of learn from each other, Karen, I want to come back once to you as well with the question, do you see Canada as a blueprint for other countries, because you have such a long tradition also in promoting pay equity and what you've been doing now? What can we copy and paste in a way from Canada?
Yeah, thank you, Henrika. I do want to say that Canada's history with pay equity has not always been exemplary. You know, I have to point out that even though we did sign onto the ILO Convention 100 dealing with equal remuneration for men and women workers for work of equal value in 1972, it was only in 1977 that the federal government brought in its equal pay provisions in line with that convention. And that was in the context of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Then there ensued about 3 or 4 decades of costly, bitter, drawn-out litigation whereby employees had to fight to have their right to pay equity upheld. And that debate, unfortunately, polarized the situation in Canada for quite some time, with unions asking for the moon and employers refusing to pay anything. So we were at a bad place. And in and around 2004, a federal task force recommended the proactive model that we now have. But it did take, you know, quite some time before that legislation was passed at the federal jurisdiction. That is, you know, 14 years, and now finally we have that. And granted, 2 other provinces in Canada have had that for longer than we have had. But they have had trouble with their legislation in terms of lack of compliance measures within the legislation. They've also had governments who've tried to strike a compromise with employers in the legislation that did not meet the constitutional requirements in Canada. So it has been it's been a long and tortured road, but I do feel that the momentum is now building. As I was saying, I feel the attitude changing as employers recognize that this legislation in the federal jurisdiction, which is really the best of all of the various different models. They realize that it's here to stay and they need to get on with it. And they're also recognizing, you know, the benefits, the business benefits of implementing pay equity, and the way that that communicates to employees that they are a progressive employer who cares about equality, systemic equality for women and for other groups. And so, you know, what I think is important about the new legislation, and I think that might be exemplary for other countries, is that it is proactive. It puts the responsibility on the employer's shoulders to do the work that's necessary. It does not leave it up to the goodwill of employers to implement pay equity. And we found that even with you know, measures that put the spotlight on employers and demonstrate that, you know, they have pay gaps, it isn't sufficient. The legislation needs to have teeth. As we've talked about, it needs to have a range of measures within it that go from promotion, education, capacity building to compliance. So the legislation, the Canadian legislation, allows me to order employers to undertake a pay equity audit and to comply with the results of that audit. Either the employer can be ordered to do it, or my office can audit employers. If they're found not to be in compliance and they refuse to comply, I can issue them with notices of violations, and I can administer penalties that range from $35,000 a day to $50,000 a day. So they are significant penalties for non-compliance. And, you know, it really, I think, is extremely important that employers recognize that, you know, this legislation is here to stay. It has teeth. And not only that, I think it is significant that the federal government has put in place a team of people that are there to support employers, and that they've appointed someone such as myself who has a long history of involvement in pay equity, knows pay equity, knows the players, knows how to work, how to broker a deal, and how to really encourage employers to roll up their sleeves and get the job done. I think it's really important that you have someone in place who has those relationships, has that knowledge, and is able to really put some muscle into, you know, muscle behind those relationships to get the compliance to where it needs to be.
Thank you, Karen. Manuela, at ILE and EPIC, the Equal Pay International Coalition, you are not only active, like getting actors together, like-minded, and talk. You really lead discussions, especially also in the last year, on how the COVID-19 pandemic has actually changed our world of work. How has the discussion in this time with this topic changed around the topic of fair pay during that time?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think that there has been a recognition that the pandemic has really triggered a labor market crisis, and women have been affected the most. So there is a recognition of that, which is quite an important starting point. There is a recognition that they have suffered huge job losses. According to the ILO monitor, the employment loss stand at 5% for women, which correspond to a loss of 64 million jobs, and 3.9% for men. Women also are the ones who have experienced serious and larger cuts in the hours of paid work. While the time that they spent on housework and family care has escalated. So these also explain the reason why there has been an increase also in the gender pay gap. At the same time, as you know, many of the previous panelists have highlighted, the pandemic has really generated a new opportunity, has emphasized how vital and life-saving the work performed by millions of workers in the health and social work sectors is. And of course, 2/3 of those who are working in those sectors are women. Many women in many workers in these sectors have lost their lives in the past year, trying to save the lives of other people's. And their pay is very low, working conditions extremely harsh, the responsibilities huge, and these have been exposed and revealed in a very powerful manner. So we have been clapping, right, to them from our balconies in sign of gratitude. But I think that now the time has arrived to translate this gratitude into entitlements, and not only as a matter of social justice or gender equality. I think that it's very clear that there will be no recovery, sustainable and inclusive, if our health and social work systems are crippled, and if the workers within those sectors are not adequately protected and rewarded. So what the pandemic has done, including within EPIC, is that it has brought to the fore the monetary undervaluation of jobs that have a huge social value. And I would say that a number of countries have indeed somehow acknowledged this by taking some measures to increase the wages of nurses, including in Germany, in France, in Italy. Of course, these are one-time off in order to somehow recognize their tremendous contribution. But it's quite telling. Also, I'm sure that you have heard about the negotiations, the collective bargaining that is underway in the UK in order to negotiate on wages in the health sector and including nurses. Wages, and what was very interesting was that at the very beginning, the employers were saying, well, we can only allow a 1% pay rise. The trade union turned down this offer. And what is interesting is that the public opinion mobilized and started exerting pressure, saying that it was indecent, that indeed, such a sacrifice and contribution to the country was not duly recognized. So now there are talks that indeed this pay rise may indeed increase perhaps by 2%. So the talks are still underway, but I'm using this example just to indicate that this would have been unthinkable. We in the ILO and in EPIC have really seen an interest in equal pay rise significantly over the past year. And I think a reflection of that interest is also because there have been new 12 members that have joined the coalition. I think there is a very genuine concern about the erosion of some very modest gains in terms of reduction of gender gaps in pay, as well as in respect of other labor market indicators. And the realization that indeed, if we want also to reactivate the economy and aggregate demand, it's very important to ensure that women are properly and fairly rewarded, because also this would be another means to attract and remain and retain more women in the labor market. In the course of the past year, there have been plenty of webinars that have been indeed organized on very particular and specific issues. And the steering committee of EPIC met about 2 weeks ago. And one of the, two decisions that they took in relation to which should be the two next subject matters on which EPIC should be focusing its attention on are indeed how to address the historic under-evaluation of women in the care sectors. And secondly, how to make equal pay for work of equal value a reality in the small and medium-sized enterprises, because I think that they represent the majority of the business universe in all countries, and they face some real obstacles and have some real concerns that indeed require some dedicated attention and this more encompassing approach in order to place them in the right conditions to be able to comply with legal provisions. Back to you.
Thank you, Manuela. Yeah, I would like to go into some kind of, let's call it a round for all, because we have one very big question from the audience, and I would even adapt it a little bit, if you permit. This goes out to Elke Ferner, who asked it, because she asked, what are the 3 most important measures to close the pay gap by 2030? And I would like to make this a round for all of you. And from my point, say, I think we need to close it by 2025, because 2030 are very big goals. That's the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And we know that if we don't close the pay gap, we do have trouble with quite a few of the other goals, meaning that if we want to close all 17 by 2030, we have to be faster with the pay gap. So I will adapt the question. What are the 3 most important measures to close the pay gap by 2025, 26, the latest, so that we can close all goals by 2030, all 17 by 2030, this way. So who wants to go first? We go to, I can see you, you have your micros turned off, perfect. So Karen, Karen, you go first.
Yeah, at the risk of, maybe missing the point here, I'm going to say that the Canadian government has decided to take a feminist approach to the recovery. And I think this is really important. And so they're looking at things like the social infrastructure that will allow women to regain employment and to recoup the losses that they have suffered. One of the key pieces, one of the key pillars of this recovery is universal childcare and making sure that women across Canada, regardless of where they live, have access to universal childcare at a reasonable cost that will allow them to regain their position within the labor force. Then I'd say the second measure would be what we've already started with, and we need to see that happening across the world, which is proactive pay equity legislation that really puts the obligation on the shoulders of the employers to take action. And then finally, what a lot of countries are doing, which is pay transparency, and that can be seen as somewhat different from pay equity, in that it exposes not just the gaps between women and men, but also, disabled women and women of color, Black and Indigenous women, and drills down into the pockets of vulnerability and intersectional discrimination that really need to be addressed in a critical way and a focused way. So I would say those are the 3 measures that are fundamentally important from my perspective.
Thank you, Karen. I have, there you go, Manuela, next up.
Yeah, well, a little bit building upon what Karen has just said, and also with a view to getting some sort of concrete results in a relatively short period of time, I think we need to really have some preferential attention paid to those sectors and occupations in which there is an overrepresentation of women. So, the care sector, the education sector, the childcare sector, etc. I mean, these are sectors in which women are overrepresented. So if we manage to indeed make a change there, this will have major ramifications in the overall gender pay gap and will lead the way and by the way, I mean, many of these sectors are also led and driven by the state. So it's also the state as a public employer that has some obligation vis-a-vis, abiding by the book. The second issue is that I would really take into account the different labor market structures of countries across the world. I mean, there are countries, I'm talking of emerging economies, developing economies, in which very often they look at this issue of equal pay for work of equal value as a luxury that only rich countries can afford, and therefore it's not something that concerns them. This is wrong. And in those countries, the large majority or a significant proportion of the workforce work informally. So we have found out that a very important means to try to improve the wages of those in the lower distribution of the wages is by really ensuring that minimum wages are regularly updated, are set at the level which is realistic. Of course, we do not want to put businesses out of business, but it's one very effective way, if properly implemented, to reduce the gender pay gap in the lower half of the distribution in countries in which there is an overwhelming majority of women working informally. And third, I would definitely, this work that we are doing in terms of assessing the impact of wage transparency law is very important. I mean, as soon as the findings are available, we would really embark in disseminating it, because it can be constitute a basis for very fair, friendly discussions among all the parties concerned. Because as all of you have highlighted, wage transparency is not going to happen if we are not embracing a sort of cooperative approach, and if we don't have the two parties at the table indeed agreeing on how to go about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I jump to Alex, and then Birte, and then Zita.
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, and it's very hard to pick just three things, but I will try. I do want to also say making pay equity more accessible has to be on that list. I think that is one of the biggest ways we can make a significant change. But the proactive model is a really important one, but I would also add to that working together. So employers, unions, employees and government, coming up with a plan. Which workforces can we target first, the lowest paid? We need to have a regime in place to do this, and not just leave it up to individual claims as they come, because I think we can really target some of those lower paid workforces and address that occupational segregation more aggressively, and that will really help. Pay transparency is obviously a really key issue as well. And I think we are not leading the way at all on that in New Zealand. We have a long way to go. And so we'll be looking to other countries in terms of what they are doing there, because I think particularly in the private sector, it is very difficult in New Zealand to understand where you sit as a woman in that structure. The third one I have is actually, it relates a little bit to the concept of bias, which is inherent in everything we do, but particularly gender bias. I would really like to see, the pandemic has turned the world upside down. It has challenged all of the ways that we work in many ways. And I would like to see us use this opportunity to really disrupt thinking around bias. And when we're putting new ways of working into practice, new systems, that we're taking this opportunity and we're seizing the chance to do things differently and to put gender at the forefront of a lot of those decisions we're making, and not treat it as a nice to have or an afterthought when we're making key decisions, in employment throughout our working lives. So I think employers really changing that mindset. We've had to be agile, we've had to adapt to new technologies, all sorts of things. This is an opportunity to change what we're doing and not just go back to the way we've always done things, because we're never going to progress.
Thank you, Alex. Birte, jetzt los.
That's a tough one. I'll make it very brief because basically I agree with all of you. I think most importantly, we need a cultural change. We needed to make it very, very, very uncool for employers to get caught paying women less for equal work or work of equal value. And in order to do that, we need politics to take charge, to take a proactive stance to expose the gender bias in pay structures, because it's completely unfair to put that pressure on individual women, because this clearly is a task for society at all. And then pay transparency, of course, is the key thing. And I think the European directive, the proposal for the European directive has so many wonderful aspects that I never ever had hoped to actually see and have a chance of becoming implemented in Germany whenever that might be the case. For German standards, that is a very revolutionary thing that was just proposed in March. I seriously didn't think that would have been possible. So that would be my very brief.
Thank you. Zita, I would like you to be very brief as well, but answer this question, please, for us.
Well, first of all, you need a political will. You need a very good connection. So let's say that I know Helena Dalli for long, long years, and I would say this EU Pay Transparency Directive really showed what we need to do. So now it's up to the national parliament how they act. Of course, we need monitoring and we need proper data. And of course, we need representation of women all levels. So this is short.
That was super short, which is great because we have strict time limits here and we are going to keep them. And we want to have Agnes finalizing. But I will come in a second to Agnes and give her the floor. Before that, I think I have a little slot as well here. It's called the call to action. So let's do a call to action with a universal fair pay check that you've already heard, when the Commissioner Helena Dalli talked mentioning it. So everything that you've been talking about and all your wishes and what needs to be done, we actually implemented them in the Universal Fair Pay Check, a certification for employers to pay fairly. And we are very happy when we saw this EU directive because it was very similar. All the wishes that we had that we put into the certification, we also wrote to the EU saying what could be in there, and we read it and we thought, wow, that's it, everything's there. So to give you a very short overview, the certification is a three-phase process, beginning with what I say, the commitment of the companies to say, hey, I want to pay fairly, I'll just do it. So I commit. And the first thing that we see, and it resonates a bit with what you said about transparency and all these things, is we want the companies and organizations to analyze the position where they actually stand at the moment. So we say the whole process is analyzing your position, developing measures, and then leading by example. So to get the first phase of the Universal Fair Pay Check, all that companies have to do is say, yes, I want it, and I will analyze my data. And of course, analyze it actually, not stop thinking. Yeah? They really need to take off their little pieces here, these horse claps, like we call them in Germany, and look at their data. And once they've done that, then they will see the gaps that they have, where they are, and then they can implement measures that actually direct those gaps. We decided to make sure that each company does exactly what that company needs and stops sort of blasting out lots of money into beautiful measures without a clue what these measures actually do. They don't have like a KPI on measures for fair pay or diversity. So we say, analyze, then do the measures that actually count. And it's not expensive because you're doing just the right thing, and that's fine. And to get that second phase, you have to have your adjusted pay gap down to 0. It can oscillate plus minus 1%. Then you have the second stage. And for the third stage, of course, you have to have your pay gap at 0, the big one. But that's the aim. You get the leader when you are under 10% pay gap. And at that point, you have to be transparent about the figures. Before that, we say, while you analyze, just go for it. We keep it to ourselves. Unless you want to tell it, you are able to do so. So I want to invite you at this point to join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. GMT, to have like that zone for everybody. So 11 a.m. GMT. It will be the very first awards of the Universal Fair Pay Check with our piloting companies who sort of started into this process. So we have from tiny little German companies with 14 employees up to the Allianz, which is probably quite well known by all of you, including Icelandic companies as well. So this will happen tomorrow and you will hear data. I can promise that one. So we count on companies doing what's the right thing. And we still want the legislation because we know that they are not all willing to do it by themselves. So get them some legislation to move them faster in a way. And with this, I want to hand over to Agnes, who's been with us all this time. She's a member of the Scientific Council Foundation for European and Progressive Studies and associate researcher at Science PO in Paris. She's a recognized European expert on gender policymaking, very important to us here. And she oversaw the EU gender equality policy in the 90s and continued to work on gender issues for the European Commission as a member of the in-house think tank, currently EPSC. She's currently a professor at the College of Europe, affiliate researcher at Science Po, founding member of the first European feminist think tanks Gender 5+, and member of the Haut Conseil de Égalité in France. I'm very honored to have you here and hand you the floor for the last closing remarks. Agnes Hubert. Please turn your microphone on. Thank you very much. Go.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, thank you for in a double way. I mean, not only for organizing this meeting, but for very interesting interventions and discussions. I mean, you've really sort of brought in a lot of new sort of issues on the table. I've taken a lot of notes, and I hope I can find my way through it to draw some conclusions. I will first sort of start because I'm a bit of a dinosaur. If you'd not noticed it in the way my I was happy to put my background, it's the reverse way around. But anyway, I'm a bit of a dinosaur, but I still want to celebrate the fact that we've done progress. We've done progress since Beijing. I was in Beijing in '95, and the big sort of the big step forward we'd done sort of internationally on the question of equal pay was to put in the platform the question of work of equal value, right? Equal pay was for work of equal value. It was not equal pay for equal work anymore. And this had sort of gone, it was already in the European legislation since the 70s, but it has been accepted at international level. What was interesting at the time, you were sort of wondering who was, I mean, if Canada was now sort of leading the way or was sort of offering a blueprint. I remember, and I want to sort of quote this more than anecdote, because I think it's a metaphor which can still be very important for us today. When we were talking about equal value, the Canadian feminists had come up with the comparison between the zookeeper and the childminder, right? And you could compare the zookeeper and the childminder for the responsibility they had on living being, but obviously an animal costs a lot, right? When a child, I mean, you can make as many as you want probably. Then the fact that there was dirty working conditions for the zookeeper, but not for the childminder. So a lot was done at the time on the question of job evaluation, job classification, how you could sort of evaluate jobs in order to be able to compare them. I think a tremendous amount of work and tools have been sort of developed since then. And now you can't sort of say, you cannot compare with sort of, I mean, with sort of proper criteria which are widely accepted. And for this, the draft directive of the Commission is still more specific about these criteria and how they should be developed. And IGE, the Institute for Gender Equality, has itself as well developed a lot of tools. So we all agree. I mean, what makes me sort of wanting to celebrate as well, it's listening to all of you from New Zealand to Canada and going through Europe. I mean, there's a real convergence of minds. There is a lot of talks going on in the different sort of circles, and we're all more or less on the same sort of visions, right? The vision that we want equal pay by 2025 or 2030. The World Economic Forum told us that equal pay was only going to be for women who were born in the year 2255. So let's sort of forget about the World Economic Forum and try and sort of drag as much all countries to sort of advance at a fairer pace. Because we know that, I mean, a gender equal world is fairer, healthier, wealthier, and equal pay is really at the core of it, right? So having legislation and enforcing it is the right way to go through for policy making, right? But the problem has really been very much to enforce it. And to enforce it, we need tools. And as I say, we've got statistics, we've got information, we've got a lot of criteria, etc. But we need agents as well. We need employees, and this is very much at the center. I mean, and very often women employees would not dare to sort of claim or I mean, even less to go to court. We need employers, and I would say social partners, because employers and unions must be very sort of involved into it. We need machineries. In the new Commission draft proposal, the equality machineries have got a real sort of role as well to support the claimants and to sort of encourage them, assist them, and help them even financially. And we need governments as well to take steps where employers are not sort of complying. This is accompanied by a strong monitoring mechanism. I want to sort of come back to, I think it's Manuela, we talked about the question of the minimum wage legislation, which I would sort of put together with, we talked about, I think Karen talked about intersectionality. And I think we've really got to think about sort of migrant women, migrant workers who are very much in the care sector as well. And sort of think we are at the moment at European level, we are sort of putting forward as well a minimum wage. The Commission is putting forward a draft directive on minimum wage. And all our sort of feminist economists around us were sort of hesitating. What, I mean, should I work more on the minimum wage, or should I work more on the pay transparency directive? And in fact, both are important, but the minimum wage is really crucial. Let's not forget it. What is important in what the Commissioner said as well, and how this draft directive is presented. Let's hope that the governments will, I mean, the member states will sort of go with it without sort of weakening it too much. But it's the idea that it should create a mind shift, right? I mean, Enrique, congratulations for this initiative. We must really sort of encourage employers and everything. But I mean, we've seen again with the recommendations that was published by the Commission in 2014 that, I mean, asking people on a voluntary basis to sort of come to terms with the things which may cost just doesn't work. How am I going to doing on time? Yeah.
Agnes,
okay.
please, one last sentence. I don't want them to cut us off because I know this line is being shut down at a certain moment. So
very quickly, I was sort of, when listening to you, I thought these agents are extremely important, right? And I thought what we need as well, we need governments to be more involved. We need sort of social partners to be more involved, etc. But don't we need as well a Me Too movement for equal pay? Because women will sort of find it difficult to sort of feel that they are, even with transparency, right? Transparency can sort of help them, but women all very often find it difficult. What I find really important as well in the draft directive, which is put forward by the Commission, is that you can have collective claims, right? And this is sort of a very encouraging sign. Just to finish, with Gender 5+, our economic think tank, we've put forward a sort of post-COVID sort of recommendations with 3 priority areas to sort of go through the care-based economy. And the care-based economy is about the zookeeper and the childminder, right? Let's sort of finance the childminders and universal childcare, etc. Then parity democracy, we won't get there if we don't have more women in charge. And the third thing is stop believing in that sort of unlimited growth and put forward social and environmental indicators next to GDP. Sorry, I was a bit long, but anyway.
Okay, Agnes, thank you very much. We are still online. So thank you very much. But I know they are cutting off there's some regulations, so I didn't want us to be cut in half of your sentence. I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. I love that we need a Me Too movement, and I'll just put a sentence to it. Nobody can stop us from being paid fairly. So if we want to be paid fairly tomorrow, we need to start to pay fairly today. And everybody can do that and look and pay fairly wherever you stand. So thank you to all the panelists, all who are out there. We hope to see some of you tomorrow or some other days. And bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
I stopped the live streaming, so we're not live anymore. Just
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much also to the other parts of the world.
Yes, thank you all. I really enjoyed it with you, and I looking forward to see you separate and joined or wherever on other occasions.
Just before you leave the room, let me read out a small message that I have just gotten, and it was really wonderful because a very good friend of ours sitting in New York and watching the live stream and said, this is one of the best panels and most exciting panels I've ever attended. All of the participants are outstanding and the rate of the discussion is absolutely awesome, grounded in specifics, implementing law and factual information, not just windy generalizations about principles and those shawls. So I wanted definitely to share this with you, and it's because I think, that's a wonderful wrap up for you and all your efforts. And thank you so much for making